The Bishop's vote moved a step closer to extinction last Tuesday when the bill which seeks to abolish it finished its passage through the Legislative Council. The bill had been paused for some time while a LegCo committee considered the impact of this measure, but despite setting out clearly that the loss of the Bishop's vote would most likely result in the loss of a Bishop of Sodor and Mann, LegCo supported Key's resolve to remove what many see as an undemocratic vote. Two of the more prominent speakers in the debate, Paul Craine later and first Gary Clueit, spoke to me shortly after the debate. You support the bill which will remove the Bishop's vote?
That's correct. I mean, it's a long-held view of, as I stated during clauses in my speeches and things. I've always believed in separation of church and state, and so, from a purely philosophical, ideological, however you want to call it, that has always been my view, and was given the opportunity of expressing that view. However, we have to always be cognizant that every law that we pass affects people's lives, and to me, it was brought home even more cogently, just the fact that the person that was going to be affected by this was a colleague, one that is highly respected. So it became down to a matter of what is fair. As I said, again, I've stated, I believe it inherently unfair to change somebody's job description essentially while they're in post. You're hired on one set of conditions and then change them in post. It has never sit well with me in any circumstance. And so I was quite happy to introduce an amendment to at least provide several things. One is a transition period, which we need for several reasons. If the easy thing to have done would have just been to stay quiet and send the thing for royal assent, and it would have all been over. But not knowing when that royal assent might come, and it could be 2 months, 4 months, we have no idea.
Because, of course, the bill, had it passed directly through LegCo, it would have gone then to royal assent, and until royal assent was granted, Tynwald then couldn't sign the bill, and it couldn't then be promulgated on Tynwald Hill, which means it couldn't be enacted.
Yeah, and it just got messy. The stumbling block for me on that is just not having anything like a date certain, so that nobody could plan for it. And if we're going to do this, overall, I think I said early on in the clauses thing, one of the things that I have great discomfort with is it's called the Isle of Man Constitution Bill. This is a constitutional matter, and I am deeply uncomfortable with deciding constitutional matters on a 51% majority vote. We've seen what happens when you do with these very, very close issues that are quite divisive, and you do that. So I think there's a wider conversation that needs to be held amongst all of the members about what do we do about that. Surely there are certain classes of legislation that need something more than just a simple majority.
In reference then to the clause, you were telling me just before we started this interview, the actual final amendment, the final draft of that was only available to you a few minutes before the actual sitting.
Yes, this has all been very last minute. Of course, the committee sat on this for a long time. And
they produced a very extensive,
an excellent report. It makes very good reading, and I think as somebody else mentioned, just for historical context, it's well worth having. But the fact is that we are down the wire on this, and that we're at a very short window. It's sort of the early part of December where this thing just times out. So if we were going to do something, we had to do something quite quickly. During clauses, I introduced the amendment, which was voted down because some members thought it was premature. But immediately afterwards, after the vote passed to remove the bishop's vote, then people were a lot more amenable to having this. But because...
So this was discussions after the sitting?
After the sitting, correct. In terms of, no, we don't. None of us I think even the ones that voted in favour of removing the vote were all aware and concerned a bit about not having some form of commencement in there, because it could be very disruptive to everybody.
Because as it's written, the bill seems to leave to the imagination when it should be brought into effect. Is that the case, or
to some extent? Yeah. The assumption was that once royal assent was given, it would be automatic. But again, that was, who knows how long that would take. I think it was just generally felt that we did need something. But then, of course, it had to be introduced in the final stage, and as you know, during final stage, you need the supermajority. You need 6 votes for anything to pass. And then it became a discussion about what the terms were, and some people felt that even the original amendment that I had put forward, which would have had it coming into effect on the day after the current bishop leaves her post. Upon reflection, that was probably not the wisest amendment, because again, it gave an undefined end date,
and many members felt that would potentially put pressure on the bishop to remain in post for as long as conceivably possible.
Right, and that was the thing. Whether the church would put pressure on her, who knows? But certainly, I think self-imposed pressure on her to stay on beyond what she might do, and so. It was late yesterday afternoon, because it did look like we were going to not do the final reading today, and I just wanted this over. So we came up with again yet another compromise, which is okay. We will put in predicate the removal of the vote either on the earlier of her departure from post, or 3 years, which was then amended by Mr. Craine to 5 years. And as I said, I'm content that the vote will be removed. That resolves my conscience and my views on democracy. But that whether the vote was physically removed 6 months from now, or 3 years from now, or 5 years from now, doesn't really bother me that much. And so I was quite happy to support that amendment, and obviously everyone else did as well, because that is what we have now.
So in effect, if Keyes supports this amendment, and of course it goes back to Keyes now for their consideration, but if Keyes does agree with the amendment passed in LegCo, so the bishop has to loses their vote either after 5 years, or if they retire from the post before that. Correct. Then the vote goes at that stage. It's not effectively allowing anything beyond 5 years.
Yes, 5 years from the announcement of royal assent, correct. There's no perfect solution in any of these, but I think what was really important, and I think Mr. Thomas had corresponded with members as well, and he'd raised some valid issues about there may well be other pieces of legislation that are impacted by this, and we do need time to consider what other ramifications and things there are, and when you don't have any specific dates in mind, which if you're waiting on royal assent is so non-specific, and that could potentially come in 3 or 4 months when Tynwald itself has a massive legislative agenda over the next several months. So looking at what impacts removing the bishop's vote might have on other pieces of legislation really is not going to get the attention that it probably needs.
And the fact that the bishop will lose their vote has to be considered, but also, obviously, in Legislative Council, it becomes much more likely that there will be a kind of a score draw for all in LegCo, because there are only eight members. The president then has the casting vote, and perhaps there needs to be some clarity as to, or more clarity, further clarity on how the president does that function.
Yes, I mean, I think the I think the default position is the president will vote whichever way to keep the status quo, which is perfectly standard everywhere. But not only that, I believe we will need to modify both Legislative Council and Tynwald's standing orders on quorums, because part of this is the bishop after this comes into effect, the bishop will no longer count toward a quorum, which leaves sittings for both Tynwald and LegCo. If you've got one member down, I mean, you could get to the point where nobody could even go to the toilet during a sitting because the entire chamber would become inquorate. So we are going to have to look, I believe, at that. And that's just one of the things. There may well be many, many other things that need to be looked at. I'm content with the outcome because now it does give us some breathing room to do things responsibly and with due consideration. I know it's not going to be a popular decision in some quarters, but we have to deal with what we've got. I swore to do the best in my power to look after the interests of the whole island as I see it, and I take that very seriously. It's not about popularity, and I suppose that's one of the advantages of not standing for public election this time round, for example, is I suspect it's going to sway certain members who are to help get re-elected. And I think we have a very different role, and it is more. This really was about scrutinizing legislation, and what we were handed by Keys was fine, but it without a commencement clause. I consider it to be defective. I'm also aware that I believe Mr. Thomas, during clauses in the Keys, did attempt to introduce an ADO, things, but it was defeated. And of course, when what LegCo passed today goes back to Keys, it could well be, it could be removed. I mean, we have no idea. It's Keys will do what Keys needs to do.
And if that happens, does that then mean that the bill comes back to LegCo?
That's an interesting question, because I've asked exactly the same thing. If Keys amends what we did, then yes, it will come right back to LegCo. If they remove the amendment entirely, my belief is that it then just goes for royal assent, and then we're back to like none of this ever happened.
Gary Clueit there. Paul Craine has a different view.
Well, I'm saddened really as we've got to the end of this, although the writing's been on the wall as we've been through the stages of it. So I'm not surprised in that sense, but I'm saddened that this is where we've reached. Over the last couple of weeks, especially as this vote has got closer. I've spoken to dozens of people over the last couple of weeks, especially as this vote has got closer. And I tried to sum up how they felt, and many of them were absolutely shocked, disbelieving that Tynwald has taken this forward. Some of them have talked about the length of time the island had a bishop, the spirituality side of things. It's just been really interesting. But they were shocked, they were hurt, they were, I wouldn't say confused, but they found it sort of destabilizing in a sense. I think that's one of the key issues that,
But isn't this, in a way, that Tynwald effectively catching up with the fact that, unlike maybe 2 generations ago, where the vast majority of people in the Isle of Man would go to church or to chapel, now very few people do.
I think the very few thousand, let's keep it in perspective. I think that's true, and I see that. I'm aware of that. But a great deal of that is more to do with not going to church than not having a faith. If you read widely Generation Z, many of them have a faith. This is not, and that's not necessarily a narrow faith and so on. But I think we're wrong to do that. But the church has been around 2,000 years, and I would say its popularity has waxed and waned over that period of time. It's not unusual to find periods when the church is not as highly as well attended as at other times. But I'm not sure that's what this is about. I think here we've had a bill that's passing through. It's been through both houses now. It started out as an opportunistic bill when there was no bishop in post. It followed votes in Tynwald in relation to the bishop's seat and the bishop's vote. I would stand back and see a bigger picture where we're in an incredibly unsettled time. You can look at, we've got war in Europe at the moment. We've got threats of greater conflicts. We've got NATO apparently less reliable than ever. The historic UK-USA alliance is less certain than ever. We've got trade wars out there. We're only just getting over a pandemic. These are very unsettled times. I find people very much aware of that. And here in the Isle of Man, where we place great value on our community spirit and our togetherness and so on, the glue that holds that together is partly provided by the church. I'm not saying the church is the only organisation in there, but it's partly provided by the church. And that is a glue. It's strong, it's very long-lasting, it's presence in every community, etc., etc. And the bishop is at the forefront of that, a spiritual leader, a pastoral leader, somebody who speaks with a very well-respected voice of compassion, of tolerance, of pulling together and so on. This is undoubtedly part of the glue of our society, the fabric of society. And I see what we've done today is to begin to loosen that glue.
Effectively, what this is saying is Keys members no longer believe it is right to have people in the Legislative Council who are appointed. So this really opens up then the next can of worms, which is about Legislative Council itself being not directly accountable to the Manx public.
It does, I accept that, but I don't think that's the discussion for today. In a sense, the more immediate next step of those who are now have removed the bishop's vote is perhaps removing the bishop from Tynwald completely, Tynwald Legislative Council, so the bishop's seat, in other words, and then what do they want? Disestablishment? Who knows? But this has been a line taken. It's a dogmatic line. I would maintain there is no democratic public mandate for this. Mr. Hooper did a consultation on this, and it's fair to say that a significant number of people in the Isle of Man do want to get the bishop's vote removed. Well, I would throw that back to you and say, on what basis do you say a significant number? Because it is true that Mr. Hooper was required by the Keys to carry out a consultation, so it was a private member's consultation carried out on his own through his own email address and so on. Those consultations, said for a long time, when you stop and look at the numbers in them, the number when the data's been collected from self-selecting respondents has no statistical significance whatsoever. That's true across government consultations, and you sometimes hear it said, oh yes, we've got the statistical significance figure. No, you haven't, because unless you're dealing with a randomly selected group. So there was a consultation. It didn't just focus on this bill about the bishop's vote. It asked respondents to comment on the bishop's seat. It asked respondents to comment on prayers in the House. That is not a balanced consultation. That would never have gone through as a government consultation. And then when the votes came back, it was split 51% to 49%. So there's no mandate in that. It was something that Mr. Hooper was required to do, but there was no mandate in that. We haven't got. I don't know. Do most people in the Isle of Man support the bishop in Tynwald in the Legislative Council with a vote? I don't know what that view is. I know the census recorded 54% who said they were Christian, but that doesn't necessarily mean they support the bishop or whatever. I think democracy, we can take a very, very narrow view of democracy, and I think that the current debate has narrowed the view even that democracy is about the votes you get in your constituency. You take the likes of Guernsey, where they've shifted and they don't have constituencies anymore. They've got an island list. And the people who are better known across the island, more likely to get in. If the bishop was standing for election in that system, the bishop would be safely in, you know. And then you go to somewhere like Australia, or, they have compulsory voting, okay? Compulsory voting. We don't have that. We have some constituencies where the turnout's well under 50%, you know. So if we've got democratic deficiencies, that is perhaps where they lie. There was a big survey done just 2 years ago by a big American group, the Pew Research Center, and they identified that when they asked questions across 23 or 24 countries about how could your democracy be improved, and these were global north, global south, you know, right across the spectrum, and some of the overwhelming things came back that, they wanted better candidates in their elections. Well, okay, what do you do about that? But they wanted better representation for groups, you know. In the Isle of Man, we've got this democracy, but are Manx-born people underrepresented here? That's something that's been getting put to me over the last fortnight. Are Christians underrepresented in this group? And I'm not talking about a representative who just speaks for the church and this is taking the Christian message, which has been the issues of tolerance, fairness, justice within the community, of looking after those in need, speaking for those who haven't got a voice, and all of these things. That sort of that voice in Tynwald, a voice that speaks totally independently, a voice that is able to speak truth to power in a way that no one else in this chamber could, because we're part of the power who needs to hear the voice, if that makes sense. I think democracy is much wider than totting up the numbers. And if you do tot up the numbers, we've got these deficiencies because of the poor turnout. Maybe the biggest deficiency in Manx democracy is that when you read someone's manifesto and you're impressed by something they're trying to achieve and you vote for them, there's no way of turning that into a majority view in Tynwald when it gets back and picks its chief minister and establishes the ministers. It's translating what's in the manifestos into what's actually going to happen in the next government. That is hard here. It's hard to do that. So I think that the democratic side to this has been overstated. You know, that shouldn't be the key issue here. The key issue should be about recognising the history and heritage of this. 1,600 years this island's had a bishop, and when the bishop loses the vote, where we've been made very much aware that the seat, the very position, the very diocese is at risk. And
to be fair, and possibly because the Church of England didn't want to be seen to be issuing threats, they haven't said that the diocese will cease to exist, have they?
No, but what they have said is from the Archbishop of York. He's put it in writing. He's said it to me directly. He's not in a position to say it would go, because it would go before a committee and a panel of some sort. The decision is not his decision to take. But he thinks it likely that there will be a reconsideration of the diocese. And if you look at the diocese, out of the 42 dioceses, one that goes across Europe, one in the Isle of Man, 40 in England, the diocese here, the diocese of Sodor and Mann, is a quarter the size of the next smallest diocese. So we're off the scale in terms of size here. The expected thing, I think, would be that the diocese here would be swallowed up in a larger diocese. There's been amalgamation of dioceses going on over the years, and the logical ones would be maybe Liverpool or Chester or Manchester or somewhere nearby. And not all of the diocesan bishops have a seat in the Lords, but those three do at the moment. And therefore, we could have a bishop who is in Parliament, but not in this Parliament, in the Parliament over there. And that, oh gosh, is a Manx.
Or actually,
that's uncomfortable.
Well, even worse. Well, I think potentially even worse. Maybe others will see this differently. You could have a bishop who has a rightful seat in Tynwald and a rightful seat in the UK Parliament, and that creates some interesting constitutional conversations.
It would. I think that's unlikely, because I'm not at all sure that we would accept here a bishop who's been appointed for Manchester or somewhere like that, who doesn't live here, who just occasionally pops over here, for that person to pop over, and would they even be bothered to pop over for every terminal session? I don't think that's a way forward. I think it's much more likely that we wouldn't see a bishop in here at all, And that's where some people in this discussion want to move this. They do want to see the bishop's vote lost, the bishop's seat lost. They do want to see church separated from state. Indeed, I've heard it said a few times that church and state should be absolutely separate. Well, in theory, you might be able to separate them, but for individuals, you couldn't separate my faith from my political understandings. They're absolutely intertwined. There's the notion that I come and talk about my politics and not my faith. For those who read the Bible, it's an incredibly radical book. It's an incredibly political book. There's an awful lot in it that's powerful and that speaks to you, especially about the way the poor of the world are treated. And that's it's powerful stuff. What's happened today, I think, is hugely saddening. I think it's a mistake. I would like to hope that it's a mistake that gets corrected before the commencement date begins in 5 years or thereabouts time. I'd like to see that change.
That was Paul Craine, MLC. So what do you think? Is this a bit of constitutional tinkering that may cause the end of a 1600-year history of Manx bishops? If so, does that really matter? How democratic is the rest of our parliamentary structure? And might that bigger constitutional review have been more useful? For now, I'm Phil Gaughan. Go to Mayo. Thanks for listening.